What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to celebrate the 50th anniversary of one of the best movies I've ever seen, Taxi Driver, which premiered in New York on February 8th, 1976, and went wide the following day. The film was written by Paul Schrader, directed by Martin Scorsese, and stars Robert De Niro as Travis Bickle.
Now, Robert De Niro creates a terrifying portrait of life on the edge of madness.
Tabby, just forget about this. It's nothing.
Taxi Driver, a film by Martin Scorsese.
Also, before I go any further, I should acknowledge that I am sick as a goddamn dog, or as Travis Bickle would say, I think I have stomach cancer. But if I wait any longer to record this video, I'm going to miss the anniversary, which is something I refuse to accept, so bear with me as I try and record this video when I'm completely incapable of breathing through my nose. In any event, as Paul Schrader has frequently said, Taxi Driver is one of those rare, lucky, serendipitous moments in movie history where you have three remarkable filmmakers colliding at precisely the right time, where they're more or less all on the same wavelength, where each of their respective contributions managed to enhance what the other artists had to say. And the film is so many things, from an intoxicating exercise in style to a nightmarish exploration of total isolation and loneliness. But most obviously, for the rest of the time, the movie's going to represent the best that New York City has to offer when it comes to stories about the city that I've adopted as my home for the last 18 years. And while I would never claim that any one particular movie compelled me to move to New York, I can't deny that movies about New York were a huge part of the decision-making process. And for years in the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was first getting to know the city just as a tourist, as I was walking around, I would hear Bernard Herrmann's haunting score as I was looking around, even though New York in the late 90s and early 2000s bore very little resemblance to the New York of 1975 when this movie was shot. And yet, every time I saw steam rising out of a manhole or a cab driving by, I couldn't help but be reminded of Bernard Herrmann's haunting theme song. And I will not subject your ears to the misery of hearing me sing that theme song when I've got a clogged nasal passage. But it's one of those unique movies where it completely changes your perception of a particular city, where you start to see that city through the eyes of Martin Scorsese, Paul Schrader, and Robert De Niro. And luckily, over the last 50 years, all three of them have been incredibly generous when it comes to interviews and documentaries and commentary tracks about this movie, many of which are contained on this Blu-ray, but you can also find a lot of those documentaries on YouTube. Also, quick side note, there's a commentary track that's contained on this Blu-ray that they claim was recorded in 1986, but if you listen to the commentary track, as I did for this video, Martin Scorsese's talking about prepping Goodfellas, and he's talking about how he's seen Batman and how he's already made The Last Temptation of Christ. All three of those things would be impossible in 1986, but for whatever reason, people keep reprinting this mistake that the commentary track was recorded in 1986. But if you put that error aside, it remains an incredibly fascinating commentary track. But the reason I bring all this up is because pretty much everything insightful or analytical or every great observation about this movie has pretty much already been made by much more eloquent people than myself. But in that Taxi Driver is one of my real formative experiences that helped ignite my obsession with movies in the first place. I'm not about to let the 50th anniversary slide by without saying a few words of my own. But the easiest way to say something original is to talk about my own first encounter with the film. So it was the fall of 1995, and I just started my first year at the University of Virginia, and I was going through fraternity rush, and one night I found myself in the room of a rush chair for a house that I was interested in, and I looked up on the wall, and I saw this poster, and I was like, what is that? And he's like, dude, that's Taxi Driver. I was like, oh, and I kind of nodded and pretended like I knew what he was talking about, because when you're going through rush, the last impression you would ever want to make is that you're not hip. Whereas Travis Bickle says to Sport later in the movie, I'm hip, and Sport's like, you don't look hip. I mean, I absolutely love that scene.
I'm hip. What, you don't look hip?
But because I didn't know what he was talking about, I quickly changed the subject and just got back to killing brain cells, as most people do in the first fall where they enter college. But I didn't know it yet, but I was about to make a hell of a lot of friends who were really into movies, especially directors like Brian De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola, and Martin Scorsese, where in the mid-90s, all three of those directors were still very much in vogue, making some of their best movies. Or Coppola, I guess after 1992, he stopped making his best movies, but De Palma and Scorsese were still on fire at that time. But over the course of that first year, we watched their movies over and over and over again, and I soon found myself buying a VHS cassette of Taxi Driver, sight unseen, but for some reason, I kind of sat on it for a while until the summer of '96, when on a whim, I just tossed it into the VCR one night, and it proceeded to completely and totally melt my brain, and that was the first screening of many. And I was soon studying the movie in film classes back at school. I bought the Laserdisc. I was getting into arguments with my girlfriend at the time about the merits of the movie. At the time, she claimed to only like the movie because a lot of film historians were talking about how important the movie was. And maybe on that night where we were arguing, she had a point. But hopefully today, I can make I can articulate a better argument on the film's behalf.
I don't like these movies.
Well, I mean, I didn't know that you'd feel that way about this movie. I don't know much about movies, but if I had
Is the only kind of movies you go to?
well, yeah, I mean,
Long story short, the movie had a major impact on me, and throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, as I graduated from VHS to Laserdisc to DVD and eventually Blu-ray, I continued to watch the movie over and over and over again, and each time I pop it in, I fall under its spell each and every single time. And now here we are in 2026, 50 years after the movie's initial release, and the city portrayed in the film is more or less gone now. But there are a few landmarks and a few relics from that bygone era still standing. As you can see in this clip here, where a couple days ago in the snow, I trudged over to 226 East 13th Street, which served as the exterior for Iris's apartment where she sees her customers. The interior was shot on the Upper West Side, but the exterior was shot only a couple blocks away from my place. But as you can see, I was trying with my iPhone to recreate the tilt shot that Scorsese uses on 2 occasions in this movie. Yeah, baby, I'm as good as Scorsese. And while I was over there, I also went searching for Sports Doorway, which is at 204 East 13th Street. Sadly, that doorway no longer exists as it was in the movie. It's been modernized. But what you can find is the little set of stairs down at 208 East 13th Street where Bickle sits down after he shoots him. But I think at this point I need to bring my lengthy preamble to a close. Also, I think I need to take off this mohawk. It's starting to stick to my head, and you know when you're sick, you get kind of hot and clammy. Anyway, the thing is disgusting. I could feel like my scalp getting greasier by the second. 20 years ago, I could actually do a real mohawk. I did it for Halloween, but now no hair grows right here anymore, so I can't shave a mohawk anymore, which is probably a good thing because it'll prevent me from going on a murderous rampage. But if you've made it this far and you've never seen the movie, I'm going to say bail out now and go watch it, and then watch it again, and then watch it again, because this is one of those movies where if aliens were to visit the planet tomorrow and say, what is cinema? You could say, well, here is cinema. Taxi Driver is cinema. And what do I mean by that? Basically, pure visual storytelling at its most experimental and its most groundbreaking and its most inspired. This is one of those movies where Scorsese, he kept getting better and better and better with each movie that he made. I mean, like Who's That Knocking at My Door and Mean Streets and all of his early movies are fascinating. But with Taxi Driver, it was like a phoenix hatching from its egg, where suddenly Scorsese emerged fully formed, and that would allow him to go on and make movies like Raging Bull or King of Comedy or After Hours or Goodfellas or any movie by him that you care to mention. But in addition to the astonishing visuals that Martin Scorsese and his director of photography, Michael Chapman, managed to cook up, it's also one of those rare, brilliant, original screenplays where if you read the original screenplay, and I tore my apartment to pieces trying to find my copy of the script. I bought a copy years ago where it had a couple different interviews with Paul Schrader, as well as the shooting script, maybe even had multiple drafts. In any case, I no longer have it in my possession, but there's a very short list of brilliant original screenplays that aren't based on a book or a play. But when you read the original text by Paul Schrader, it's as good as any poem as you might come across. It's as good as any play you might come across. It's as great as any novel that you might come across. And as Martin Scorsese said himself, it's one of the few occasions throughout his career where he was presented with a screenplay where he felt like it was finished. And obviously, as they were shooting the movie, they added a little improvisation here and there. And usually when a director signs onto a project, they're going to work quite a bit on the screenplay moving forward before they start rolling cameras. But Scorsese took one look at the screenplay and was like, yeah, this is the script that I want to make. And I'm going to keep coming back to Martin Scorsese's initial commentary track for the movie, because as great a filmmaker as he might be, you could make a case that he's an even better film history teacher or film technique teacher than he is a storyteller, because as he's doing the commentary track, he's constantly just like giving us this barrage of information about what kind of technique he's employing when he's using a tilt versus a tracking shot versus whatever the case might be. And of all the filmmakers that I've been obsessed with over the years, I think Martin Scorsese has taught me more about film than any other director, because he's made so many incredible documentaries about the craft itself, like that recent documentary Made in England, the films of Powell and Pressburger, or my favorite documentary about movies ever, A Personal Journey with Martin Scorsese Through American Movies, not to mention the countless movies that he's restored explored and presented. Movies like Jean-Luc Godard's Contempt. I've discovered so many incredible movies thanks to Martin Scorsese. And so even though I've been studying Martin Scorsese's work for decades at this point, I still find myself in the position of being a student every time I hear him opining on the craft of movies. But I think at this point I've said all I can say without going into details or spoilers or whatever the case might be. Once again, if you've not seen the movie, go watch it a few dozen times, then come back to this video. This video is not going anywhere, but I think when it comes to discussing this movie, the best place to start is with the origins of the screenplay and the great Paul Schrader. Now, of all the filmmakers who have ever lived, Paul Schrader definitely has one of the most unusual origin stories because he grew up without movies. He grew up in a strict Calvinist household where he did not see his first movie until he was 17. And then he more than made up for lost time and got really obsessed with European art house movies from the 1960s, but obviously was really interested in literature. I mean, the screenplay for Taxi Driver obviously is lifting a lot of ideas from writers like Thomas Wolfe and God's Lonely Man. But when he was a film student at Columbia, he got obsessed with the films of Yasuhiro Ozu, Robert Bresson, and Carl Theodor Dreyer. And he even wrote that essay that got turned into a book, Transcendental Style in Film, but somehow managed to lose it over the years. But it was during this time that he befriended Pauline Kael, easily one of the most influential film critics of the time, and he became one of her little acolytes, a group that was nicknamed the Paulettes. But Paul Schrader is one of those diehard movie freaks who spent thousands of hours alone in the dark. He's a kind of unusual character where he wouldn't bat an eye at the prospect of going to see like an Ingmar Bergman movie playing at a porn theater on 42nd Street. And you can definitely feel that in Taxi Driver, that mix of the profane and the divine colliding together. But eventually Paul Schrader found himself in Los Angeles where he was spending a lot of time alone and he was really struggling to make a living as a film critic. He was going through a bad divorce. He was getting rejected by one of his girlfriends. And there was one point where he says he realized he'd basically gone like 3 weeks without interacting with another human being. And at one point, he basically decided to lock himself in the apartment of one of his girlfriends. And he wrote 2 drafts for Taxi Driver in about 10 days. And shortly after this, his life would start to change very quickly. When he sold his screenplay for the Yakuza, which would eventually be directed by Sidney Pollack, and strangely enough, or not so strangely, I tackled it on this channel with Moose Madsen and Tony Stella last year for that 50th anniversary. But that screenplay sold for a record sum at the time. And after that, and after Taxi Driver, he would start directing movies like Blue Collar and Hardcore and what else? American Gigolo and Cat People. I mean, as a director, Paul Schrader would eventually emerge as a pretty titanic force in his own right. But in the early 70s, when he wrote Taxi Driver, he was in a very specific headspace that's reflected in that incredible voiceover narration that is littered throughout the film. And as Paul Schrader has said repeatedly, he was influenced by a variety of filmmakers while writing the screenplay, like the film Pickpocket by Robert Bresson. That was a huge source of inspiration. Or Ethan Edwards in the movie The Searchers. That was a huge inspiration. Or as he describes it, the apotheosis of the psychopath was directly inspired by the climax to The Wild Bunch, directed by Sam Peckinpah. Then, of course, when Scorsese got his hands on the screenplay, he started bringing in additional influences from Mario Bava and Jacques Tourneur and George Stevens and a bunch of different directors he was inspired by. And for diehard movie freaks out there, one of the greatest pleasures of this movie is always looking for the little movies within movies that are kind of tucked away on the marquees in the background. Like even Clint Eastwood's The Eiger Sanction pops up in the background as Betsy's trying to get away from Travis Bickle. But at the core of the screenplay, we have what Paul Schrader has frequently described as the Madonna whore syndrome, where Travis Bickle has one Madonna that he wants to turn into a whore, and there's a whore that he wants to turn into a Madonna. And Travis Bickle, in a lot of ways, he's such a massive contradictions because on one hand, he'll say a man shouldn't devote himself to morbid self-attention, and yet that's all he does throughout the entire movie. Or he'll talk about how he hates the gutter world of pornography, but what does he do in his spare time? He goes to porn theaters. And Martin Scorsese said it's a very Catholic thing, this idea of Travis Bickle constantly hurling himself into an environment that causes him misery, like his willingness to work anytime, anywhere, in the worst neighborhoods at the worst possible time, even though those environments are very rapidly pushing him over the edge.
I work anytime, anywhere.
Will you work Jewish holidays?
Anytime, anywhere.
All right, let me see your chauffeur's license.
And Travis Bickle just has so many warring impulses where he'll seem somewhat puritanical in his attitudes, and yet the environments in which he spends most of his time are the exact opposite. Or he'll talk about how he constantly needs to get fit and get healthy and so on and so forth, but he's popping pills and has this horrible, atrocious diet. But when you really get down to the nuts and bolts of the screenplay that Paul Schrader wrote, what's unusual is how he included almost no camera directions of any kind. There was one very specific camera move that he specified in the script, and Michael Chapman, in his infinite wisdom, did his best to recreate that, where they basically spent 3 months like splitting a building down the middle so that they could do that overhead tracking shot at the end of the movie. And when they split the building like that, it basically disrupted the structural integrity and almost split apart and came in two. But I think that was very wise on Paul Schrader's part to devote most of its attention to great voiceover, great characters, great dialogue. And luckily, Martin Scorsese and Michael Chapman were more than up to the task of cooking up the rest of the shots. But before they were ready to roll cameras, there was one major change made to the screenplay, because as both Paul Schrader and Martin Scorsese have stated in the past, the character as originally written was much more overtly racist, where it's a little bit more subtle in the final film. And as you're watching the movie and you're seeing the way he looks at certain people as they walk by, you can definitely tell those attitudes are very prevalent. But like take the character of Sport, for instance. The pimp in the movie originally, as written, was black. It helps that Harvey Keitel wanted to play Sport, and like, all right, that solves that one problem. But Paul Schrader has said he felt like it would have been socially irresponsible to lead the screenplay as it was. And obviously, you can write a movie about a racist character without being a racist writer. And who knows what the movie might have been like if not for those changes. But as the old expression goes, sometimes less is more. But there were a few other changes between the shooting script and the final movie. Like the big example would be the scene between Sport and Iris up at 226 East 13th Street, or at least the exterior. And that's the one change that Paul Schrader's pushed back on. And I actually have to take Paul Schrader's point of view on this, because the screenplay originally as written, every single shot in the movie and every single scene in the movie is from Travis Bickle's perspective. And I feel like the moment you stop seeing the world through his own kind of warped gaze, when then it kind of breaks the internal structure or just the overall tone of the movie. And I feel like everything in this movie should be completely subjective through his eyes. Early on in the movie, it rigidly adheres to that structure, but I think the reality is Martin Scorsese just wanted to have more scenes with Harvey Keitel and Jodie Foster, and so they kind of cheat. They show a cutaway of Travis Bickle sitting outside, and then they tilt up to the apartment. But it also, another reason it doesn't quite work is that at that point in the movie, Travis Bickle has started cutting his hair much shorter, and you can tell they're using that shot from another scene. It wasn't shot for that scene. So anyway, that's my one major criticism of the movie, is that they break their own internal logic for the movie. And if you pay close attention, there are a few other little details in the movie where we're seeing things that aren't from Bickle's point of view that should not be included. Like a perfect example would be when Bickle, toward the end of the movie, he's got his mohawk and he's driving on his suicidal mission toward Sport's doorway. There's a cutaway to Sport dealing with the customer who eventually will get shot in the face by Travis Bickle later on. But that's a cutaway that we, the audience, can understand because he's cross-cutting like any old movie. But Bickle, once again, Bickle's not there, so we shouldn't be seeing that. Or the most obvious example would be the scene between Albert Brooks and Sybil Shepherd at the campaign headquarters for Palatine.
That's not fight.
But there's a pretty lengthy, flirtatious scene between Brooks and Shepherd as Bickle is sitting outside looking in, but honestly, we should not be hearing that dialogue. And apparently Martin Scorsese was having so much fun working with Brooks, he wanted to add one more scene where Brooks would be interacting with Palatine, but ultimately they decided to cut that scene. But just as a way of closing up this chapter where I heap praise on Paul Schrader's one-of-a-kind original screenplay for this movie, it's tough to include my favorite excerpts in this video because usually you got Bernard Herrmann's score playing while Travis Bickle is giving us that incredible voiceover narration. And so I'm unable to include my favorite passages from the movie without getting nailed for copyright strikes with this video. But I think my favorite line from the entire movie has got to be, "Loneliness has followed me my whole life, everywhere, in bars, in cars, sidewalks, stores, everywhere. There's no escape. I'm God's lonely man." And obviously, Robert De Niro delivers that line much better than I can. And that's Paul Schrader, obviously, very overtly showing his debt of gratitude to the work of Thomas Wolfe. And it must be said that Paul Schrader is the best kind of collaborator because he's not the kind of screenwriter to hover around the set and make sure that everybody's rigidly adhering to every single word, because he feels like by day one of the shoot, a screenwriter's job should more or less be finished, and if not, something's dreadfully wrong. And once the movie was underway, he went back to LA to start working on his movie Blue Collar, and he trusted Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro. And at one point during the shoot, Robert De Niro called him and was like, "Would Travis Bickle say the following?" And Paul Schrader said, at this point, you've lived inside his head so long, you probably have a better idea of what Travis Bickle would say under those circumstances than I would, which leads to some of the great improvisational scenes in the movie. Because in the screenplay, there's a passage where it just says Travis Bickle talks to himself in the mirror, but it gives no additional explanation beyond that. But in the movie, it's like a 5-minute sequence where Travis Bickle's looking in the mirror like, you talking to me? You talking to me?
Well, I'm the only one here. Who the fuck do you think you're talking to?
And it's just inspired stuff. And so it's ironic that the most iconic line or the most memorable line or the most popular line from the movie doesn't even actually come from the screenplay as written. But you could easily psychoanalyze this character until the end of time, talking about his pathology and using all those big words. But I think in the end, this is a movie about isolation. It's a movie about loneliness. And I don't know if there's ever been a movie as powerful on that front before or since. But luckily, Taxi Driver is one of those movies that's going to stick with us for probably centuries. But now let's get into Martin Scorsese's contributions to the movie, because as good as the screenplay is, it really starts to bloom once Martin Scorsese comes on board and starts thinking up some shots. So early on, producer Michael Phillips was considering hiring Brian De Palma to direct this movie. It would have been quite a different movie, probably an equally interesting movie because Brian De Palma was really firing on all cylinders back then. But an interesting thing happened. Once De Niro and Scorsese signed on to make this movie, it took a little while before the movie got made. And between the time when they signed on, the careers of Schrader, De Niro, and Scorsese all bloomed in the interim, making it a much more commercially viable package, because Robert De Niro won an Oscar for The Godfather Part 2 and was off making movies with Bernardo Bertolucci like 1900 and was even flying back to New York, driving a cab for real in order to prepare for this role. But Scorsese, after he made Boxcar Bertha, he made Mean Streets, one of the best movies that he's ever made, and some of the actors from Mean Streets pop up in Taxi Driver. And he also directed Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, where he met the young Jodie Foster. And obviously, Paul Schrader's, his whole life changed once he sold the screenplay for the Yakuza, but it just feels like the stars were aligned and all three filmmakers involved, they kept getting better and better, and suddenly they were ready to make one of the best movies ever made. But in spite of their success, they still kept the budget for the film relatively low. The budget was $1.9 million back in 1975. And to his credit, even though Robert De Niro's career had started to bloom in the interim between when he signed on to the film and when they shot it, he let his salary remain the original agreed-upon salary as opposed to demanding more money now that he was an Oscar-winning actor. But apparently there was this funny little anecdote. While he was getting prepared for the role and he was driving a cab around New York, another actor got into his cab at one point and he saw De Niro driving. He's like, wait a second, you just won an Oscar and you're still driving a cab? Are things as bad as that? Anyway, great little behind-the-scenes anecdote. But because it was a relatively low-budget movie, Martin Scorsese had a very tight shooting schedule. Like that famous overhead tracking shot at the end of the movie, they had 20 minutes to shoot it. They spent 3 months designing the shot, but due to labor laws using child actors, they had a very narrow window in which to get it. I think they got like 2 or 3 takes. So luckily, they nailed the shot, but it's like, oh my God, you spent 3 months planning for a shot, and you only have 20 minutes to get it in the can. But luckily, Scorsese loves doing storyboards and he loves cooking up shots. And Michael Chapman says that Scorsese's storyboards are the best kind of storyboards because they're not incredibly specific, but they include a lot of camera direction, they have a lot of energy, and they give you an idea of what he's trying to achieve, but not narrowing your options. But Martin Scorsese in this movie basically put to use every single technique he had learned up to that point. Some of these techniques are borrowed from other filmmakers, and some of them were cooked up all on his own. Like the most famous example is probably when Travis Bickle takes a tablet of Alka-Seltzer, drops it in a glass of water, and the camera is just slowly but surely zooming in on the glass, and that was directly lifted from Jean-Luc Godard's film. 2 or 3 things I know about her were basically in the surface of a cup of coffee. It almost looks like the swirling profundity of the universe. But a lot of these shots were cooked up by Martin Scorsese himself, like what has been described as the loneliest shot in the history of movies, where Travis Bickle, he's had this disastrous first date with Betsy, where he took her to a porn theater, it blew up in his face, and now he's on the phone basically begging and pleading for the opportunity, perhaps to see her again, or at a minimum, maybe he can call her again. And almost like the camera knows that the emotion is too intense and too unbearable, the camera just drifts away for this lonely shot down the hallway, which was shot at the Ed Sullivan Theater. But it's one of those shots where in purely visual terms, the movie's hammering home just how isolated Travis Bickle is and just how lonely Travis Bickle is. And it's just the stuff of movie-making genius. But for me, a huge part of the enduring power and the enduring appeal and the enduring fascination of this movie is how, over the course of the film, we start to get on Travis Bickle's wavelength without even really realizing it. I feel like a lesser filmmaker would have constantly had to remind us, oh, Travis Bickle, he's guilty of deeply antisocial behavior, and he's a bad person, and this should all be frowned upon. But in this movie, he's like, like doing like clap push-ups and pull-ups and burning his hand on the stove. As I'm watching him, like fuck yeah, he's getting in shape. I start to feel the emotions he's feeling. Or when we see him making that elaborate contraption on his arm where he can slide his hand forward and a gun will pop into his hand, it's almost like he's turning into Batman in those sequences. But you don't realize that you're almost kind of becoming complicit in this grand scheme of his where he wants to, assassinate Senator Palpatine. It's funny. I always want to call him Senator Palpatine, which was quite a different character from quite a different franchise. Although Marcia Lucas, who was married to George Lucas, was the editor on Taxi Driver. But as he starts to put together this grand plan of his, you don't even realize to what extent you started to see the world and experience the world through Travis Bickle's perspective. And as we'll get to in the legacy of the movie, that's part of what drove John Hinckley Jr. trying to assassinate Ronald Reagan back in 1981. But getting back to that kind of raw, dangerous, animalistic power at the core of the movie, it's tough not to feel exhilaration during certain sequences, even as we become increasingly horrified by the person that Travis Bickle is transforming into. Like when he goes into the bodega, where we have that great scene with Victor Argo. But Victor Argo is one of those legendary New York character actors who's been in a million movies set in New York, especially movies directed by Abel Ferrara. But in that scene where Travis Bickle decides to intervene and shoot the robber dead then and there, it's impossible to deny that on some level we're not thrilled by the sequence, even though we might be horrified by Travis Bickle basically embarking upon a career as like a murderous vigilante. And along those lines, we got to talk about Stephen Prince, who's one of Martin Scorsese's close personal friends, who shows up as the gun dealer in this movie. And for people who have not seen it, you got to see a movie called American Boy, A Profile of Stephen Prince, which Martin Scorsese directed a few years later. And I don't want to get sidetracked talking about the life and career of Stephen Prince, but let's just say the person you see in Taxi Driver, that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right behind the cash register, the owner kept a .44 Magnum, a 6-shot, right? I cocked it, turned around, and the guy was just coming through the door. The doorway. And just as he was coming through the door, I fired.
But during that scene, we can feel ourselves getting on the wavelength of Travis Bickle as he's considering all the various options. And at the end of the scene, when Stephen Prince is like, what about like grass, mescaline, blah, 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 starts like listing all these drugs and like Cadillacs and all that kind of stuff. I was like, you know what? I might say yes to all the above.
How about dope? Grass, hash, coke, mescaline, downers, Nebutalol, chloral hydrates.
But I think that's something that oftentimes is missing from contemporary movies, where in order to really explore the dark side, you have to also show the appeal of the dark side. I think so many modern filmmakers, so many lesser filmmakers are so concerned about condemning this behavior, they forget that in order to really slam that message home, on some level, you're going to have to seduce the audience and lure them in and let them acknowledge just how enticing this world is as well, which ultimately makes the overall emotional impact all the more horrifying and all the more impactful in the long term.
Crystal meth. I can get you crystal meth. Nitrous oxide. How about that? How about a Cadillac? I get you a brand new Cadillac. But
it's funny. I've been watching this movie now on repeat for 30 years, and I'm still learning new details about the movie. Like in the commentary track, the first commentary track that Martin Scorsese ever recorded for the film, he's frequently calling attention to the fact that he tried to shoot the movie with a lot of techniques that he learned from horror movies, as opposed to like gritty, authentic, like ultra realistic movies shot on the streets of New York. And I was like, all right, yeah, that actually makes total sense. Even like the cab itself is almost like a monster in a monster movie. But as you're watching the movie with the commentary, he'll say, oh, well, Mark Robson's film Isle of the Dead, it scared me so badly when I was a kid, I ran out of the theater, so I'm using this shot from that. And because Martin Scorsese talks so quickly and with such intensity, he can flesh out little behind-the-scenes details very quickly as you're watching the movie. Like a perfect example would be the first time Travis Bickle meets Iris, and he's leaving her apartment, and he's walking down the hallway toward character actor Murray Mostyn, who was in a ton of Martin Scorsese movies. He was in Mean Streets, he was in After Hours, he's awesome. But as De Niro's walking toward him, about to return that crumpled up bill that Sport first dropped in his cab a while back, Scorsese's like, oh, this is a dolly shot. And I never even noticed, but the camera's behind Travis Bickle's head, and as he's moving towards Murray Mawston, yeah, you can tell he's totally on a dolly. He's not even walking, but you only notice those details when you have the director of the film himself calling attention to it, because it's just a split-second little shot. And in yet another example, there's a scene where Travis Bickle's on his way to his date with Betsy, and he's all dolled up, and he's walking toward the camera in slow motion. But if you listen to the commentary, Martin Scorsese will describe how they shot it with a 600mm lens, where everybody else is in soft focus. But the goal was they wanted to slam home the message that Travis Bickle is totally isolated. Even when he's in a sea of people, he's all alone. But it's just a great example how inside the movie, you're getting the idea of Travis Bickle's total isolation without them having to spell it out in a literal way. And it's just yet another example where cinema is a visual art form. It's a visual medium. And if you can say something with pictures instead of words, more often than not, that is pure, raw cinema. But the biggest lingering impression I got about the shoot for Taxi Driver, both from the commentary tracks as well as the documentary, is just how torturous shooting a movie can be for Martin Scorsese. Because even though he plans everything out in advance and he surrounds himself with an incredible cast of characters behind and in front of the camera, a lot of his closest friends, you can tell he just suffers miserably throughout the shoot. Because obviously shooting in New York in the summer, it's gross. It's hot. There was actually a strike at the time, so a lot of the garbage you see in the movie was not even supposed to be there. It's just because nobody was picking up the garbage. But it was a tough, brutal, physically demanding shoot. But what Scorsese really likes is the editing process. But even though he loves the editing process and worked with several really, really good editors for this movie, even that can be incredibly torturous because it was an incredibly short editing schedule. Anyway, Martin Scorsese is one of those artists where you can tell he really suffers on behalf of his art, whether he's shooting the movie or cutting it or fighting with the MPAA over different cuts for the movie. Every step is absolute agony for Scorsese. So much so, when he recorded his first commentary track for the movie, he hadn't revisited the movie in more than a decade. Like he says, there's certain movies that he's made that he enjoys rewatching. He really enjoys rewatching The Last Temptation of Christ. But it just blows my mind that you can make a movie as great as Taxi Driver and not want to rewatch it like once a week for the rest of your life. But even though Martin Scorsese really suffered throughout the shoot, throughout the editing process, and all the battles over the depictions of on-screen violence, I do think ultimately he was successful, where he had this goal early on, where he always thought it'd be wonderful to shoot New York in a way where he sees it and the way he experiences it as he's walking around. And I think as you watch the movie and you're getting all those beautiful montages of like traffic lights going by and you're hearing Bernard Herrmann's score, it's like, you know what? If you got to walk a mile in Martin Scorsese's shoes and see New York through his eyes, it would be those early scenes in Taxi Driver. But one of the real miracles behind the making of this movie is how, in spite of the fact that they had a screenplay that was more or less ready to go, and in spite of the fact that they had a very short, tight shooting schedule, they remained incredibly open to improvisation and changes and new ideas. And a lot of that came from De Niro, a lot of that came from Harvey Keitel, but even a lot of that still came from Paul Schrader. Like famously, there was a night where Paul Schrader called Martin Scorsese in his hotel and said, "I met Iris last night, meet us for breakfast at 8 a.m. And the girl in question was Garth Avery, who plays the friend of Jodie Foster's character in the movie. She was a real-life prostitute on the streets of New York, and she was a junkie, but she started working with Jodie Foster to help her craft the character of Iris. Just little details like pouring sugar on bread that's covered in jam. It's fucking disgusting, but when you're a junkie and you're craving all that sugar, just little details like that help flesh out the character. Or the fact that she doesn't get together with people for breakfast until like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because obviously she is working in the evening. But it's absolutely awe-inspiring that Jodie Foster at such a young age could bring so much to this movie. And I think a huge part of that was a lot of rehearsal with De Niro and a lot of rehearsal with Harvey Keitel. And according to Jodie Foster, she says that Robert De Niro insisted that they get together repeatedly and just sit in a diner, order some coffee, go through their lines, and then start improvising lines. And Robert De Niro has a very unusual acting style where oftentimes he's very understated. It's a little bit like in boxing where somebody's a counterpuncher, where they wait for you to make the move and then they respond. And so he's got a very muted style of acting at time, which means that she would have to do a lot of the work and bring a lot of the energy. And contrast that with some of the scenes with Sybil Shepherd, where she's very beautiful and very easy on the eyes, but she had a very different approach to acting and just a very different attitude about acting altogether. And apparently she could barely remember her lines during a lot of the scenes that she shot with Robert De Niro, and only because Marcia Lucas is an absolutely brilliant editor were they able to kind of splice together and cut around some of her fluffed lines and fumbled lines to create scenes that work as well as they do. But getting back to Jodie Foster and her lengthy rehearsals with Robert De Niro, I think all those rehearsals paid huge dividends in the final product, because the scenes between De Niro and Jodie Foster are just absolutely astonishing, as are the scenes between De Niro and Keitel. But obviously those two guys, they're old pros at this point. I mean, Keitel, he'd worked with Scorsese on Who's That Knocking on My Door, and obviously he was the lead in Mean Streets, where he and De Niro just, setting the screen on fire in every single scene in which they appear. But even though Keitel only has a few lines or a few scenes in this movie, he delivers maximum impact. And all those little details, like that big long fingernail, obviously for like snorting coke and that sort of thing. But for whatever reason, he really wanted to play that role. He was originally asked to play the role played by Albert Brooks. He said, no, I want to play Sport.
You got a gun? Get the fuck out of here, man. Get out of here.
But those interactions between Bickle and Sport are just incredible. Like when Sport flicks the cigarette butt at him and the sparks fly everywhere. Once again, only two actors who are very comfortable with each other can create those kinds of scenes. But it leads to one of the most vicious, nasty lines in the history of movies, where Travis Bickle pulls his gun and says, "Suck on this." And for people out there who have heard my podcast Wrong Reel in the past, during the intro, we include that line, "Suck on this." But it's just so foul and so vulgar, so direct and to the point, and so perfect for that moment. Only Paul Schrader can, in 3 syllables, give you a line as impactful as "suck on this."
Suck on this.
But maybe at this point I've heaped enough praise on some of the cast of the movie. We got to talk a little bit about some of the technicians who worked on this movie, like Dick Smith. This is kind of a vanishing art form, but he was a master makeup and special effects artist, where that final shootout at the end of the movie would not have been as dramatically impactful if you don't have somebody like Dick Smith there to make it work. And luckily, Martin Scorsese and Dick Smith were able to work together in a way where, because Martin Scorsese could very specifically explain how he was going to cut and which shots he was going to include, that allowed Dick Smith to make much more convincing special effects. Like the knife through the hand, if you look closely, it's a retractable blade going up to the hand, and when they cut to the other side, the blade's already up. You don't actually see the blade going through, but due to Martin Scorsese's cutting and Dick Smith's effects, it creates the illusion that we've seen the knife go right through. Or the moment where Travis Bickle gets shot in the neck. It was an incredibly difficult shot to achieve because they were shooting in a long hallway, which limited Dick Smith's options. And he basically settled on using like a fishing pole and a monofilament line, so that at the appropriate time, you could just go whoosh, and kind of yank that patch off and create the illusion that Bickle had been shot in the neck. But it's that kind of craft and that kind of artistry that's kind of a vanishing and dying art form in 2026, because it's incredibly emotionally impactful in the context of the movie, because it feels so real and so tactile and so practical and so visceral. But when you fix everything in post, all the effects start to look the same. So what you really need is a special effects artist or a makeup artist there on the set, working with the director hand in glove, trying to achieve these shots. And I just feel like so much is lost when you kind of fix it in post on the computer many months after the fact. As fascinating as all this behind-the-scenes information might be about the shoot in New York and all the incredible craftsmen and all the incredible actors that worked on the movie, I feel like the real magic of this movie, the real miracle of this movie, happened in post-production, because Martin Scorsese had a very short window before he had to deliver his first cut of the film to Columbia. But even as his editors were racing around the clock trying to get the movie ready for Columbia, Martin Scorsese would intervene from time to time and insist upon certain bizarre editorial flourishes. And a great example of that is where basically the movie has the equivalent of like a record scratch, where it kind of skips and goes back a few seconds and starts over again. The editors had no idea what Martin Scorsese was doing, but when you watch the movie, it totally works. Luckily, he had a few superb weapons in his arsenal because he had Marcia Lucas, an incredible editor who edited some of the best movies of the 1970s. And she had a few other editors working with her in order to meet the deadline. But it was eventually decided to rope in composer Bernard Herrmann to compose the score. And Martin Scorsese had never worked with a composer before. He just liked using rock and roll songs and that sort of thing like you see in Mean Streets. But Bernard Herrmann, how can I say this? When it comes to movie music, I think he's the best to ever do it. And some are going to say, how dare you? It was Ennio Morricone. More power to you. I love Ennio Morricone too. There are a lot of great composers out there. But any composer's career that begins with Citizen Kane and ends with Taxi Driver and is sprinkled with a lot of Alfred Hitchcock movies in the middle, that's very tough to compete with. And Scorsese was a big fan of his scores for Vertigo and for Marnie, two of Hitchcock's best movies that I highly recommend. But I would say maybe North by Northwest is his best Hitchcock score. He did a lot of great scores for Hitchcock, but Citizen Kane's pretty goddamn good as well. But he was toward the end of his life. He quite literally died while making this movie. I think he had 2 days to record the score, and he died after the second night. The movie is dedicated to him in his honor, and he's a famously kind of a tough, kind of irascible old dude, and it took a little persuading to get him to come on board, but honestly, Taxi Driver would not be Taxi Driver in the absence of Bernard Herrmann. But even though he could be a little grouchy and a little disagreeable, he was also very open to collaboration with Scorsese. Like my favorite moment of the movie, well, arguably my favorite moment of the movie, at the very end, after Travis Bickle drops off Betsy and he's driving away, and he looks up in the rearview mirror and kind of has a little freak out, and you realize, oh my God, he's still fucking batshit insane. And as Paul Schrader says, the movie could basically start over at this point and the whole cycle could begin again. Like, is Travis Bickle just going to keep doing this over and over and over again for the rest of his life? But it's that unusual moment where he looks in the mirror and you hear that really strange music cue. That was Bernard Herrmann with a xylophone. But Scorsese was like, well, it's not quite like alarming or unnerving enough. And as he was storming out of the room, Bernard Herrmann said, well, just play it backwards. And it totally works. That is a xylophone being played backwards, but it's just this eerie, bone-chilling moment where if you blink, you'll miss it. But as you revisit the moment, it's just like, oh my God, like the nightmare is just going to go on and on and on until the end of time. But a lot of people operate under the mistaken assumption that Bernard Herrmann's final score is Obsession by Brian De Palma. And I love Brian De Palma, but he actually had recorded that score for De Palma before Taxi Driver. The movie was just released after Taxi Driver, but Bernard Herrmann was only one of many talented technicians that were part of kind of the murderer's row of incredible crew that Martin Scorsese assembled for the post-production on this film, like Dan Perry. He did the title sequence for the beginning and the ending of the movie, and it's a small, simple thing, but Martin Scorsese had wanted to work with him on Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and Warner Brothers had shot him down at the time. However, before Taxi Driver, Dan Perry did the title sequence for The Exorcist, and suddenly everybody realized, okay, Dan Perry knows exactly what he's doing. But when you watch Taxi Driver, the way the title cards look and the way like the closing credits look, it is an eerie part of the overall package where the music and the photography and the titles and everything comes together for this overall seamless whole that is unlike any other movie that we've ever seen. But speaking of things that people have never seen before, the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, they weren't quite prepared for the final bloody climax to this film. And they were going to slap an X rating on this movie, and Scorsese was contractually obliged to deliver a movie with an R rating to Columbia that was financing the movie. And so he had a pretty nasty battle on his hands, and depending upon which stories you believe, some people claim that Martin Scorsese stayed up all night drinking and had a loaded gun and was prepared to execute some of the executives at Columbia. But eventually they came up with a creative compromise that would allow the movie to be released as it was shot, but they had to make a very subtle change to the very end of the movie. And you can see when the movie makes the switch, as Bickle is driving to his final face-off with Sport and Save Iris, etc. and so forth, you can see the footage changes in its texture, where it becomes more high contrast, more grainy, and the color starts to resemble slightly more kind of black and white approach. And Scorsese at one point had even debated possibly shooting the movie in black and white. But you can see where the movie makes that pivot. And if you're listening to the commentary, you hear Scorsese get very animated when the movie's overall look starts to shift. But as a result of this compromise and this change in the look, the blood is less red and the blood is less vibrant, and that was enough to satisfy the MPAA and to give the film an R rating. And the only person who really seems to really dislike the change is cinematographer Michael Chapman. When you watch the documentaries with the making of, Michael Chapman says the ending of the movie was so much more impactful and so much more explosive when you got to see all that vibrant red. Sadly, the original negative with the red as it was shot has been lost to the ravages of time. So we'll never get to see it as it was originally intended. But at least the movie got released more or less intact. And the biggest surprise of all is that it became a successful movie. On a budget of $1.9 million, this movie grossed $28.6 million. And I know in 2026, people are like, who cares? Like $28.6 million. But anytime you make a movie for $1.9 million and you have a nearly 14 times return on the initial investment, everybody's very happy, and that means you're going to get to make more movies. But then again, everybody wasn't completely happy because apparently the movie got a bit of a mixed response at the Cannes Film Festival, where a lot of people were booing the movie. But, 20 years later, people were also booing Pulp Fiction. So I feel like getting booed at the Cannes Film Festival is kind of a badge of honor. And also, the movie won the Golden Palm Award, which is the highest award that you can win at the Cannes Film Festival. But I should also add that at the time of the movie's release, it had one of those legendary trailers with a voiceover narration by the legendary Percy Rodriguez. And if you look at Percy Rodriguez and all the trailers that he worked on back in the 1970s, you're like, oh my God, like these are all my favorite movies. But Percy Rodriguez always brought that signature style to every trailer that he worked on.
The critics called him a brilliant new talent. After Mean Streets, they said he was a genius. For his performance in The Godfather Part 2, they gave him the Academy Award.
But as far as the enduring legacy of the movie is concerned, obviously, it has inspired a laundry list of some of the best filmmakers of the last 50 years. But in 1981, when John Hinckley Jr. attributed his assassination attempt of Reagan to this movie, it opened up the discussion of to what degree are violent impulses, like to what degree can you attribute them to books, movies, games. It's an ongoing debate that'll never go away. And at the end of one of the documentaries about Taxi Driver, Paul Schrader says some very insightful things on this topic, because he says the compulsion oftentimes, anytime somebody says, oh, well, this game made me do this, or this show made me do that, is to ban the media in question. But he says what happens if you start banning books or movies or games or whatever that explore the pathology of incredibly violent, fucked up, just antisocial characters like Travis Bickle, what ends up happening is that you're left with a world where you've taken away the art, but you still have the individuals that are suffering from that pathology. And the way he describes it is, you can ban the novel Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, but Raskolnikov, he will still be out there. And so it's a fascinating debate, like, to what degree should the artist feel responsible if they write or direct a movie that inspires a violent act? And obviously that's something that Paul Schrader and Martin Scorsese have to wrestle with. My own point of view is that people always have to be held personally responsible for their actions, whatever they might have been inspired by. And Paul Schrader also points out the old famous Coppertone ad for a suntan lotion where you have the little dog pulling down the bathing suit of the little girl. Apparently there have been a lot of people who have been guilty of some pretty horrific, disgusting crimes over the years where they were triggered by or inspired by seeing that ad. It's like, well, this is an ad for suntan lotion. So if an ad for suntan lotion can spark crazy behavior, perhaps the responsibility lies with the individuals committing those acts as opposed to the people just trying to sell suntan lotion. But obviously anytime somebody tries to kill the president, it's going to attract a lot of attention, both negative and positive, to an individual movie. But luckily no one's ever been able to censor Taxi Driver or remove it from circulation out of fear that it might inspire new horrible violent acts. But I think at this point, I've said just about all that I have to say about this movie. And I know I've neglected a lot of key ingredients. Like I'm feeling a deep swelling of guilt that I've not paused to give enough attention to the actor Peter Boyle, who I love in Young Frankenstein. I love Peter Boyle in just about everything.
Yeah, shoot, that's why they call me the wizard.
As I said at the beginning of this video, I am sick, and everything in my nasal passage right now just feels like a wall of concrete, and I'm ready to just have some hot tea and slow down and start editing this video. So I apologize for any ingredients or scenes or details where I did not give it adequate attention. But I think at this point I've officially hit the wall on this video. But I hope you enjoyed this 50th anniversary review for Taxi Driver. There are definitely going to be more of these videos throughout this year. Like we've got Network right around the corner and a bunch of other good 50th anniversary possibilities in the not so distant future, as well as some 75th and 100th anniversary videos as well. And I'll leave a link down in the description below to some of my previous anniversary videos of a similar nature. But thank you so much for sticking with me and listening to my nasally voice throughout this video. If you like this video, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting the notification bell. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.